So, if you're familiar with the conference space a lot of you are aware of NeurIPS, which started as NIPS or NIPS a long time ago, over 25 years ago. And this was the original meetings were about neural information processing. So NIPS stands for Neural Information Processing Systems. And so a lot of that early work in what we now know as NeurIPS and we associate with machine learning and deep learning and AI really came out of this idea of simulating the brain or simulating neural systems. And so another conference where this is also the case is called CoSyNe. And CoSyNe is more focus on computational neuroscience and models of the brain that were computational in nature. And so, and they started out in a ski resort in Utah in the United States called Snowbird. And then they moved to Denver for a while, and then they moved to Europe in Portugal. And so it's definitely evolved. The entire field has evolved. And this is an article from a Substack, Renato Duarte. And he's talking about, he did like sort of a bibliometric analysis of the conference proceedings from CoSyNe. And he did this over 22 years. And so the idea is to kind of go through, he calls it the intellectual DNA of computational and systems neuroscience, which is basically saying what are the trendy topics, and then how do they change over time. So I found this to be really interesting. This is the graph that he created, and so this is based on the keywords in abstracts or the keywords that are submitted with abstracts. And you can see all these topics on the left here. So information theory, oscillation, Bayesian, primate, fMRIs, just like things that, systems people were using, topics that people were talking about, methods that people were using. There's RNN, optogenetics, backpropagation, deep learning, connectomics, neuropixels, compositionality, large language model, LLM, and transformer. And then we start with 2000. It starts in 2004 and goes to 2026. And then there's this relative frequency of the term. So the dark brown or dark red is like near 1, and then the white box or a white square is 0. So you can see that there are a lot of things that were their white squares kind of in the early years, and that's because those things weren't around yet. So deep learning wasn't really represented in the conference until about 2013 or 2014. You had self-supervised, which is interesting because people weren't really talking about it much until about 2013 or 2014, and then they stopped talking about it and picked it up again in like 2022. Large language models, of course, aren't even mentioned until 2023, and transformers as well. Some things, though, were like really hot early on and then have kind of trailed off. So you have information theory, which was very frequently talked about in the aughts and even into the teens. And it started to trail off as of recently, maybe the last 10 years. We also have oscillation, which of course has to do with brain activity and brain circuits generating oscillations. That was very popular in the aughts and has trailed off, but not as much as information theory. We see a similar trend with Bayesian, and of course this is where we're building these Bayesian models, which where we use priors and we use data and we use a posteriori distributions to update the prior. And that is, again, an approach that was used quite frequently back in the aughts and maybe in the teens, and not so much now. I mean, less. It's still used, but less so. And then, plasticity has been kind of constant throughout. Sequence has been constant throughout working memory. This is interesting. Naturalistic and embodiment. So naturalistic it's had some sort of ups and downs. Embodiment has certainly had its ups and downs. It was very frequently mentioned in the 2004 meetings, and then kind of trailed off for a while, and then started to become popular again around 2011, and then tailed off again a little bit, and then this year it's actually very popular again. So people go through these cycles sometimes of talking about topics. And sometimes it's just maybe who's submitting work, or sometimes it's like, you know, um, every time there's a new method, we think about the implications for embodiment. And it almost seems like sometimes we talk about the same lessons and never learn any of them. Like, we'll introduce a new method and they'll talk about, okay, yeah, but this should be embodied ideally. Okay, great. And then we come up with another method, which is also something that should be embodied, but of course it isn't. And then someone says, well, yes, it should be embodied and it would work better. And then people forget again, and on and on, and that sort of thing. So I think this is a gold mine in terms of thinking about these, sort of the evolution of these topics. It really is useful. So he's going to the meeting in Lisbon, CoSyNe 2026. I wanted to step back before the talks begin and ask, what can 22 years of CoSyNe content tell us about the evolution of computation and the systems neuroscience as a field? So he downloaded every available CoSyNe program book from 2004 to 2026, extracted the abstract's text, counted keywords, and identified patterns and trends in the data. All the data and code with interactive visualizations can be found at this link, which I don't have the link to, but you can go to the link is at groundedneuro.substack.com, and it's this post 22 years of brain science. And you should be able to get access to, or at least get to that link. The results paint a clear picture of a field in transformation. So, he talks about the sort of the evolution of where this was taking place, sort of at this secluded location in the mountains, and it was invitation only, to today where it's more open and more accessible, I guess. So the early attendees in even before it started in the aughts, the meetings actually started back in the late 80s. And so this was the Snowbird meeting on neural networks at the time. Tony Zador, who's a luminary in the field of neural networks and things like that. He's also working at the Cold Spring Harbor Lab, I believe. And you had people like John Hopefield, Terry Sejnowski, Sarah Soya, Jeffrey Hinton, and Jan LeCun. Some of these people we know from AI, some of these people from neuroscience, and this is kind of the flavor of the meeting, was kind of bringing those two fields together. The meeting evolved into Neuro IPS, which, by the way, 2000s had drifted so far towards machine learning that computational neuroscience scientists found themselves homeless. So this is sort of the idea here where, we can look at the evolution of this meeting in terms of how NeurIPS evolved. And NeurIPS evolved from these meetings on neural networks where people came together. And then with NIPS, you had they became bigger and bigger. And then by the time we had the deep learning revolution, it really took over the meeting. And so the computational neuroscientists shifted to CoSyNe, they shifted to other places. So Zador basically created another meeting in Jackson Hole, which is another ski. They love ski resorts for some reason. And so the idea was to, sort of, if you think about people who work in AI, you kind of tend to think of them as technologists. But back then, several decades ago, they were really doing a lot of the theory. They were trying to do theory in neuroscience because neuroscience is very skewed towards data collection and experiments. The theorists tend to be sort of gadflies, or they're model builders, and they're not really viewed as real neuroscientists. There's this whole thing about like the culture of the field. This is kind of, now you just think of AI people, but back then, like Terry said, Janowski is a theorist, right? Sarah Soya is a theorist. Even like John Hopefield, I mean, he's building neural networks, but he was really theorizing about the brain, and so forth. So this is where they wanted this, they had this sort of split. And then in terms of what Zador wanted to do with this new meeting, he wanted to create an oral program where the experimentalists were featured. And the idea is that it's easier and more proficient for theorists to grasp experimental jargon than for experimentalists to tolerate pure theory, which is interesting because, the idea is that like the experimentalists are, doing something that's accessible but has a lot of jargon, and you can learn the jargon. But the pure theory is just gibberish to the experimentalists, which is interesting because, all I'm saying is that it worked. And so it just, it helps people engage better by making that assumption. So for the first time, people building models and people recording from neurons were actually talking to each other and finding common ground. So that's good. So then in 2004, Zador, together with Alexandra Pouget, Carlos Brody, and Mike Shadlin, founded CoSyNe. This first meeting was held at Cold Spring Harbor with 200 participants. The following year, moved to Salt Lake City with workshops at Snowbird, establishing the two-part format. And so then the meeting started to grow. By 2019, you had over 1,000 people. Then it moved to Denver, and then it went to Lisbon. And so it became more and more exclusive. Well, it was exclusive to begin with, but it became more and more exclusive in terms of its acceptance rate. So this is where, it kind of goes through the different aspects of the meeting and its growth. And I wanted to get, this is the graph again, the heat map. And I think the lesson from this heat map is that there are 4 eras in this data. So he extracted and kind of proposed these 4 eras. So the first era was the classical era, which is 2004 to 2010. That's where you had focus on Bayesian inference, information theory, oscillations, and decision making. And this shows the influence of sort of cognitive science and sort of the computational models. So in cognitive science, is very much focused towards Bayesian inference, information theory, and decision making. And then in computational neuroscience, or in neuroscience context, you have oscillations because you're looking at neurons. You're looking at predictive models, but you're looking at predictions amongst neurons. You're looking at information processing, and you're looking at like behavior, like decision making. The field in this era is asking basically the variations on the same question. And that is, how do single neurons in small populations encode information optimally? So then the second era was circuits and tools. This was around 2011 to 2017. This is where you're starting to see things like optogenetics. Because optogenetics sort of was originated in this era. It really became a tool people could use in their labs. Mice became the dominant model, so we use mouse. People were using Drosophila. Before that, they were using humans. They were using a number of different systems. Because we had optogenetics, because we wanted to do things like direct measurement, direct sensing of things in the brain, we could use mouse. population coding, which is where we're looking at this signals from populations of neurons, like the movement vector or other types of signals. That's also growing. The field shifts from asking what does this neuron encode to what does this circuit compute. So back in the classical, we were asking basically the question of, how do neurons encode information optimally? In the circuits and tools areas, what does a circuit compute? So that's good. We're moving up to circuits. Then in number 3, the third era is the manifold era. That's 2018 to 2022. This is where there was a focus on latent variables, dimensionality reduction, and neural manifolds. This is definitely showing the influence of deep learning and other types of models in machine learning, where we have these things as sort of ways to do what you're trying to do, and then applying it to the brain and trying. So there's this back influence of the forward influence is using sort of a metaphor of the brain to build neural networks and things like that. In this case, we're learning how to build those artificial models, and we're bringing those tools back to computational neuroscience. And so the field is asking during this period, what is the geometry of population activity? That is, when we get the signal of population activity, how do we interpret that? Well, how do we interpret the geometry of it, and how does that describe what it's doing in terms of behavior? And then we have 2023 to the present, we have Neuro AI, or loosely defined as Neuro AI. So this is defined in this conference at CoSyNe as talking about transformers, large language models, foundation models, and model interpretability. So this is these topics that they define as Neuro AI. AI companies sponsor keynotes. The boundary between neuroscience and machine learning dissolves. So that's kind of the different eras. And so some themes have endured, however. So behavior dominates every program book, and it's increased over time. Mouse has nearly tripled in frequency. Consolidating is the dominant model. Population, circuit, and plasticity hold steady throughout. These are the concepts that we really want to study. And so these are the constants of computational neuroscience. It's cut off a little bit, but basically working memory, which has been stable but relatively infrequent. Decision-making, circuits, populations, navigation, plasticity, and then behavior, which is very general term. But these conceptual or these definitional terms have remained constant. Now, one thing that's declined a lot is this reliance on Bayesian models. So in the early years, everyone was a Bayesian, and now a lot fewer people are Bayesians. Bayesian inference stayed in the toolkit. What withdrew was the Bayesian brain hypothesis as a headline concept. So in the aughts, there was this very popular concept of the brain called the Bayesian brain, which is that the brain does decision making by having a store of prior information or a model of prior information. It updates that prior with data it collects from, through sensory interactions, and it updates that model accordingly. And that's part of the basis for active inference in a way. And active inference had its roots in that era, where they're using the Bayesian brain hypothesis as sort of an assumption. Information and oscillation also follow the same trajectory. Frameworks that were once organizing principles have faded into background methodology. Basically, this person feels that the field came to terms with the usefulness of these framings as methodological tools rather than explanatory models. And so that also, because those methods have decreased in frequency, they've become maybe more sort of self-evident. We've had other terms that have risen, and sort of terms that are new and people want to explore them. So one of those is manifold. Another one is latent or dimensionality. And these terms represent something called the population doctrine, which is that neurocomputation lives not in the individual firing rates, but in the geometric trajectories through high dimensional spaces. And so, yeah, then finally there's this AI invasion where you have, you know, the AI oriented approaches, and there's been a lot of emphasis on that in the recent meetings. So we've had RNNs, which were recurrent neural networks, which have been around since the beginning of the conference, but they've really exploded since deep learning took off. And once deep learning became a household term, RNNs became less emphasized in the keywords. Now, it may be in the content of the papers, but not the keywords. So that's important to remember. Sometimes these terms just become embedded in other terms, and it's not a keyword anymore. But the newer terms tell a sharper story. So transformer and large language model and foundation model didn't really appear until the early 2020s. And so that's, kind of the trends that we see in the conference. They're experimental technologies and the trends that this person predicts, which is that connectomics will have its moment, compositionality will probably also have its moment, and some of these terms will become maybe more integrated with the field and more self-evident, and so they'll just sort of fade into the background as keywords, but they're still not, they're still foundational to what people are doing. And of course, this is the biggest potential disruption or maybe misstep is AI native neuroscience. So forget using AI tools to analyze neural data. This is about treating AI systems as model organisms. Studying transformers the way we studying mice, probing the circuits to understand computation is maybe a new direction, but maybe it's misguided because, what can you actually learn from it? So I don't really think that that's necessarily a bad thing, but that is something to watch out for.